All right, guys, so before we jump in and start coding up our front end, I want to just talk about the folder structure and the full stack workflow because this stuff can get a little bit complicated. And there's really no right or wrong way to do it. There's going to be cases where you may have your back end completely separate than your front end. So different folder structures, you may even host them on different platforms and just make your HTTP requests from your client to your server. Now, I usually like to keep everything together. So this is the structure that we're going to go with. So we have our backend, our Express API. We've already done that. We have routes that we can hit to create, read, update, and delete ideas. We have a MongoDB database deployed in the cloud. So this part of the application is already done. Now what we want to do is create the front end, and we're going to use our Webpack environment. So what we'll do is create a folder called client inside of the root, and that's where our Webpack source code will go. So all of our front end modules and everything like that will go in here. This will also have its own node modules folder, its own package.json, because you're going to have front end dependencies that have nothing to do with your back end dependencies. For instance, we're going to install Font Awesome. That's not something we need to install on our back end. All right, now this client folder does not get deployed. When you're ready to upload this to a host and deploy, this client folder doesn't go because this is just your dev environment. Now, when you run npm run build, that creates your production files. Remember, we had it go into a folder called dist. Well, now we're going to have it go into a folder called public because we're going to set public to be the Express static folder. Because in Express, you can declare a folder to be static, meaning you can put HTML files in it, CSS files, and that's what will be loaded in the browser if you go to that domain. All right. Now, while we're developing, we're going to use the Webpack dev server, which runs on localhost 3000. And we're going to have our API running on localhost 5000. But once we're ready to deploy, you run npm run build, your production files go into public, and then your public is loaded on 5000 with the API. Okay, so these are just development files for the front end. This stuff here is what actually gets deployed. All right, so I hope that makes sense, and I think that as we move along, it'll make more sense. I know that this can be a little difficult to understand, especially if you started this course learning what for loops and arrays were. So if you got this far and this is like your first or second JavaScript course, then congrats, because you've made it a long way. But let's get started. I want to set this up. In the next video, we're going to have our client folder with Webpack. We're actually going to use the Webpack starter that we already created, and we'll get going on the front end.